what are the types of research design, right? They're quantitative, qualitative. This everybody knows. They're mixed designs also now, right? Quantitative is basically there is a hypothesis that is created from a theory, and then the hypothesis is tested through data analysis, right? Through numbers. So you can identify cause-effect relationships, or you can just identify relationships between different variables, right? Uh, the most scientific form of research design is the experimental design, which is usually lab-based, but not necessarily always. The experimental method measures the effect on a dependent variable by manipulating the independent variable, so cause and effect, right? The steps are pre-decided by the experimenter, saying that this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen. And then you try and establish causality by controlling all the other confounding variables that are in and around it, right? So you test a hypothesis, which is developed from a problem. You control the conditions in which the person is performing the test. So you control for the time of day, you try and control for the kind of food, you try and control for their mood, you try and control for whatever events are there, you try and make the lab equipment the same, right? And all of those kinds of things. And then while you're collecting data, right? There are three larger principles that are important, right? Two principles actually. There is replication, that is the importance of experiments is that if I do an experiment and I find cause and effect, then anyone else who does the same experiment should also find cause and effect in a similar manner, right? So if you think of one of the best ways to think about this is think of classical conditioning by Ivan Pavlov, right? What did he do? He was looking for something else altogether, right? He was trying to find the digestive system of dogs. But in that process, he noticed something weird, right? He noticed that every time he got the food, dogs were salivating. And it was a very gruesome study, okay? I don't know if you all know this, but he had actually removed the entire skin of the dogs from here and he had attached those sweat, not sweat, those like, what is that called? Suction valve sort of thing, right? To take all the, from the, this, what is it called? Spit, right? So, what is those glands called? I forgot, my God. Spit glands, no. Salivary glands, right? So in the salivary glands, he had attached certain pipes sort of thing, right? And he was trying to figure out the digestive system and the effect of saliva on digestion, basically, right? And what he noticed was every time he got food, those pipes started to have more saliva going through, right? And then he had a research problem. He's like, why is this happening, right? And then he conceptualized an experiment where he got food and then he removed food and then he noticed that, oh, food is causing it. Then he rang bell and then he gave food and then again he saw that bell is itself doing it, right? So he devised all of these things, right? Now, when he wrote this entire paper, if I was sitting in Timbuktu, right, and I tried the same thing, I would have found similar results, right? So that's the importance of replication. Then it starts to give you a law sort of thing, right? Um, Identical procedures place irrespective of time. That's the important thing. Similar procedure, if I use in a similar place, irrespective of time, it should work, right? What replication does is it avoids experimental error, meaning that if there is a fault in the design, then if somebody else replicates it, they find the fault and then they say, okay, this cause and effect is confounded, right? Uh, the other thing with the experimental method is that it's randomized, right? Which means that the participants, etc., are not chosen just like that. And they're not pre-decided that you go here, you go there, your scores are higher, you go on the side. All that is not done. So that independence allows for better validity, right, of the research study. Now, there are different types of experimental methods. There's pre-experimental, pre-post-test experimental design, which is you do a pre-test and a post-test, but you have no control. So this is still an experimental method, but it's a weak experimental method. Okay. If you have a pre-test, post-test design without a control group, it's a weak experimental design. If you have a control group and you're still doing pre-test, post-test, then that's a strong experimental design, right? Then you have true experimental design. This is what generally happens in labs, where you do an experiment and you control every possible variable that can interfere with your study. Then you have quasi-experimental research study, where the participants unfortunately cannot be randomly assigned because you're not very familiar with the population or you may not know if there are too many people willing to be part of the study or not. So you just choose whoever you get and put them in different groups. So they're not random in that sense, right? So again, it's not a very strong experimental design, but in the social sciences, it's acceptable because we are still dealing with errors in people and we are expecting error to exist even if it's a true experimental design, right? And then you have an ex post facto research design where a research is done after an event has happened. So the independent variable is the event. So if say Corona, suppose tomorrow Corona is over, right? And you test people's emotional resilience day after tomorrow. So that will be like an ex post facto research design where you create an experiment to find out people's emotional resilience or whatever after the event, right? After Corona, or when the tsunami struck in the southeastern belt, southeastern ocean, basically, right? That time, if you were testing people and their emotional resilience and whatever else, then you were sort of doing an ex post facto research design. So now that can be an experiment or not an experiment. That depends on how you want to run it, right? Uh, the non-experimental is there is no causation or effect, but you're trying to see relationships between many variables or factors, right? So there's correlation, which is where you're trying to see whether two variables are positively correlated, which means that they are moving in the same direction, right? And how much is like the change in one is linked with how much change in another, right? So one is not causing the other, one is not impacting the other. It's just that change in one unit of A, you notice that there is a change in unit of B, right? And that is related by the correlational coefficient, right? We'll come to it later. And then you have regression, which is predicting an outcome. So a change in one, right? How much can we predict will take place in the change in Y because of A, right? Not very important, so you can sort of ignore it for now. When we do the statistics, we'll understand better. How do you collect data for quantitative? Very simple. You have a survey where you have questionnaires, right? Even when you're doing an experiment, usually people have surveys where you use questionnaires. Then you have experiments. Now, experiments today, you can do online experiments also. You can do cognitive experiments on the laptop also, or you can do like traditional experiments. And then there's the diary method, which is not very often used, but it's a very interesting kind of thing where you send the same questionnaire to people at different time points to see how different uh, their answers are basically. So you get like a longitudinal change in their data, right? Then quantitative data analysis, usually you use statistical softwares like IBM SPSS or AMOS or R or Python, whatever you want to use. One of the things that is done in analysis is people create models, right? So they sort of give a relationship between different variables. So moderation or mediation, when you do, you usually create a model. Mediation we've seen, right? An outcome can be explained by the effect of a third factor. Then you have Sobel's test. Sobel's test is interesting. It's something that's on the rise now, and lots of journals are expecting Sobel's effect test to be there. This is basically telling you the effect of the mediator, right? So the outcome, the difference of the outcome with and without the mediator is what the Sobel's effect test does. And then you have moderation analysis, which is again, you're trying to see the strength or the direction of the relationship of the third variable with the depending variable, right? This is simple enough. We've covered all of this. Then you have qualitative research, right? Qualitative research, you sort of analyze and you generate data which is not reducible to numbers. The focus is on interpreting the information that you get, finding meaning in the interpretation that you get. So it's a much deeper and richer sort of data that you collect. But at the same time, it's also going to be biased, right? That's an underlying understanding that exists. Irrespective of how scientific you make qualitative research, bias is an inevitable error that will be there, right? Qualitative research is usually more like it's more inductive, meaning that it's more theory generating. So especially when you do stuff like grounded theory and all, it's like an exploration into a new idea where nobody else has been searching about it, and therefore you're the first person who creates a theory based on it. So there is a recognition for the researcher's perspective and subjectivity, right? In the qualitative method, data is collected through usually interviews, which are either structured, mixed, or unstructured. Structured meaning that there are a fixed number of questions, fixed probes, and only those are asked. Semi-structured is where there's flexibility, but there is still a structure to follow. Unstructured is you just go in and you have a conversation with them and sort of understand what's going on. Then there's focus group where there is like a group discussion with a small number of people who have certain criteria that they're fulfilling, and you get there and you have a discussion with them about a particular topic. Then there is naturally occurring data where you like observe people in the natural day-to-day environment. So you can have participant observation or non-participant observation. Participant is where you are a part of the group and you're observing them. And then there is non-participating where you're not part of the group and you're observing them, right? And observations are where you're observing everything. So in observation, usually it's very important to have memos and files and all of that kind of thing, right? Um, Then you have qualitative data analysis. There are lots of forms. Again, I'm keeping it to four. There's narrative analysis, which is the understanding of data from stories. So when you interview people or you talk to them, they tell you their life story and you sort of analyze different people's life story and see what is similar. Then you have discourse analysis, where you understand different situations and create meaning. So you ask people, how has Corona affected their life? You ask that to 10 people, and then you understand and you try and analyze what's going on there, right? Then there's archival research, which is using information from the past, right? Like books, newspapers, letters, stories, census, laws, whatever, right? Using all of that information to try and conceptualize the lifestyle of a person or whatever. And then you have thematic analysis, which is the most used form of qualitative data analysis, which is you do interviews with people or you do focus groups, and then you code all of those things, saying that, okay, I noticed this, I noticed this, I noticed this, I noticed this, I noticed this. And then across all of the interviews, for example, you notice similar codes. So you start categorizing them as themes, and then that gives you a larger theme, and that's it, right? Um, any questions? Then you have, I'm assuming no question, but all this is no. Then you have ethological research, which is the scientific and objective study of animal behavior. So ecological is human, ethological is animal behavior, right? So any animal assisted therapy, etc. All of that is based on the ethological research paradigm, right? Then you have mixed methods where you mix both qualitative and quantitative method. So there is exploratory sequential design and an explanatory sequential design. Exploratory sequential design is quali first, quanti second. Explanatory is quanti first, quali second, right? Uh, Usually why you do mixed method is to triangulate the information. So you use multiple forms of research design and data collection and analysis so that you get sufficient evidence to support the finding, right? Or to disprove the finding, saying that these two things I used the qualitative method, quantitative method, and this is what I found. They agree or they disagree, right?